All right, welcome to Antidote Radio, where we actually verify our sources and we really try to make sure that everything that we say is verified and we can back it up somehow, unlike some resources on the alt-right, which apparently do not participate in fact checking when they receive a big breaking news article, as we'll get into here. So let's just get right into it. Buzzfeed came out with this article just, I believe, yesterday, and this, I guess it was a social experiment. Would you like to call it that, Jeremy?
Yeah, or like maybe journalistic jamming or something,
Okay.
culture jamming or that type of thing.
Well, whatever it was aimed at Infowars, and this man who wrote this story, his name escapes me at the moment, contacted Paul Watson of Infowars.com via direct message on Twitter, because I'm surprised, by the way, he accepts DMs, knowing how much criticism he probably gets. But in this case, he accepted this direct message for this guy who claimed to be with NBC News. He didn't elaborate on that, but he had this breaking leak that there was going to be a new audio tape of Donald Trump, and he was insinuating it was going to be Donald Trump using language like the N-word, for example, that was going to come out within 2 days of the inauguration. And he noted, this person who sent this email noted that that the media was not expecting this feud between Donald Trump and John Lewis, and that whole thing that's gone down there with John Lewis being the hero of civil rights, Mr. Goldman Sachs, whatever you want to call him, corporate stooge. Martin Luther King would be really proud of that. But so, and this audio was going to be leaked, and Infowars ran with this as a front page news story. I saw the article. I didn't actually read the article, but I saw the link to it on the Infowars website, where it was literally this big tape audio was going to be released of Trump saying some racially charged comments right before the inauguration. And it turns out that this was not a real story at all. This guy had used it to pretty much get... I called it a social experiment for that reason. It's like they were just... This man was looking to just feed them a fake news story and see how Infowars, or Watson in this case, reacted to it. And this guy, and even asked Watson if any of you have if you have a direct connection to SB, meaning Steve Bannon, the Trump chief strategist, who the mainstream and alternative media have both completely missed the point about in terms of his real connections to who he's connected to and what he represents. And Watson tells him that Alex Jones has a connection to Bannon. He'll pass this on to Steve Bannon. I see two big problems with this. There are two major, I think, implications involved with this. Number one is that if the story is true, and I don't really see as bad as BuzzFeed is, I don't see a reason for them to make up this story. Number one is that Infowars, or at least Watson in this case, and this really brings to mind a lot of the more sensational stories they've run with over the last 6 months, with constant assassination threats against Trump, to the whole Hillary Clinton is a literal demon idea, not just a figurative demon, but a literal demon from hell. That they're just as long as it fits what they're trying to promote, that they just run with these things, don't try to do any sort of fact-checking or try to find the legitimacy of the sources that are feeding the misinformation. William Cooper talked about that years ago, how Patriot Media just runs with these stories that are given out by intelligence agencies that are false leads to get people all paranoid and afraid. The other implication of this is that this is that Alex Jones and Infowars have a direct connection to the new White House and the new administration via the chief strategist Bannon, and it really brings into question the uncritical acceptance of everything Trump does, including all of these Goldman Sachs and Rothschild Inc. and TPP supporting, Trans-Pacific Partnership supporting cabinet picks. Jeremy, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I'd say it's the patriotic Goldman Sachs.
Of course.
And the patriot nationalist Rothschilds and former Soros bankers.
Tillerson supporting TPP doesn't matter because he fights climate change, whatever that means.
And so I think you're right about some of the main pieces of this buzz. What's it? Buzzfeed.
Buzzfeed.
I mean, Paul Joseph Watson is partially right in terms of BuzzFeed being sort of cancerous in terms of But at the same time, this is an important. I would call it a counter sting of some sort, because actually it's sort of like Project Veritas or James O'Keefe style, the way it's sort of sort of like front groups or sort of falsely. There's a leading sort of attempting to sort of bait or to entrap, even maybe potentially. Sure. In this case, it's not illegal activity; it's just so-called fake news now. So I do think that that is key, and it was so interesting to I did see that Alex Jones was immediately trying to inoculate, sort of precautionarily, preemptively inoculate his audience to this thing coming out, and he say, well, Trump may have said these things, but everybody sort of blows off steam in their own way. So it gave a really like an insight into the way that the sort of oncoming scandals that are going to necessarily pop up in this new administration,
already rationalizing it,
are going to be handled, by the new mainstream set. And the other side of it, I would say, it actually sort of shows this whole era of the fake news era. And because there was a sort of a triggering, a positive triggering in the sort of amongst the supporters of Trump when Trump called CNN out in his press conference for being fake news. Okay, so this is basically, you can see this is a counter hit in some way by those that are considered the fake news by the Trump supporters, such as Buzzfeed and their connection to CNN and all that type of scenario, and then them, their operatives, Buzzfeed operatives at some level, planting fake news, manufactured so-called fake news into Infowars to show how there's not much sourcing, or there's not much fact-checking. So at the same time, I would say the bigger framework of this is in the idea of the conspiracy theory has broken down as a construct. It served its purpose for 50 years in terms of its start by the CIA, and in terms of portraying anybody who is questioning the lone gunman, assassin theory of the government in terms of Kennedy as conspiracy theorists. So that's broken down, and conspiracy theory became to be related to or associated with people who are willing to do actual analysis of deep politics. Okay, so that became actually sort of like that might become a good thing. So now fake news has been introduced as a concept, and this is one now where those who used to be called conspiracy theorists can now take this and throw it back at the mainstream news. So what we have here really is there's basically a double flip here. So the conspiracy theorist news, or like the so-called alternative news, has now become the new mainstream, and now it's destroying or taking down a notch the old mainstream by calling it fake news. So this is an interesting moment here to see the ascendancy of the alternative news framework. And just one last thing I'd point out is that it's as we've spoken about before in terms of this response around some of the alternative news sources around the Kansas City arrest case, where we gave them like weeks of lead on the mainstream media, but still some of them, such as Infowars, have still not reported on the case, the key First Amendment case in the country. What this points out is what we've sort of always heard, and I feel like I've always known, is that at some level it's much easier to own or control alternative media because it has smaller budgets, there's less people involved.
Easier to destroy.
Breitbart News. Think about in this connection of Infowars now being fed into the Breitbart construction. Breitbart was started with $1 million, $2 million by a single guy, right, in relationship to Andrew Breitbart in terms of this trip to Jerusalem and this relationship with Israel and Breitbart. So that's obviously some type of, it was started by a single person with a few $1 million. You couldn't start the New York Times with a few $1 million.
And they're easier to destroy also if they step out of line. They're easier to punish. And, this will be something to get into another show, but you bring Breitbart, and that connects you to a man named Robert Mercer, who's been one of Trump's biggest supporters. We can get into him another time, but it's really fascinating to hear both the mainstream and quote alternative media constantly calling anything that comes out from the opposing side fake news. That's a really fascinating scenario to see play out. Now, the other big implication of this is that this article, via Watson, if this article is true, and I do believe it's true, I'm not going to come out and say this fact because BuzzFeed is such a really terrible source that we should really verify that it is fact before we run with it. But I mean, I have seen no reason to believe that this was a fake story. If you believe Watson and these direct messages, yes, Alex Jones has a direct connection to the White House via Donald Trump's chief strategist. And a lot of people will say, well, Jones has already said he has connections to the White House, but these are the good guys. And break down, in a couple minutes if you can, just what you feel the seriousness and why this is a concern that Alex Jones and Infowars are now being admitted via this Twitter exchange that yes, they do have direct connection to the White House and to Donald Trump himself via his chief strategist.
Well, it was already sort of apparent, or de facto, everybody knew it, that Alex, the Infowars operation, as Alex would call it, has become a part of the same, the media collaboration that included Breitbart News. I mean, Roger Stone, as a media operative, as a political operative, had come in along with it, and had obviously he very much applauded the choice of Steve Bannon as chief strategist in the Trump White House. So it was pretty obvious that there was this relationship here. This made it very factually oriented. That yes, okay, messages can be communicated. The other thing about it is this is Alex has basically said over the last few years, he always said that Infowars is part of a media set that includes, he used to say WorldNet Daily and Joseph Farah, but he's always been saying Drudge for a long time, and Drudge had this relationship where he began to put the sort of less threatening Infowars stories, what I would say, onto the front page of Drudge, thus sort of getting Infowars tons more traffic. Yeah, so this is a long-term strategic play that Alex has been making, and now you can see the politics of this. It's very clear with Breitbart. It was created in Israel. It has a strong relationship with Netanyahu. People like Bannon are clearly tied into the similar type of politics or thinking in a way, and so that.
Yeah, for sure. This brings me to something because a lot of the anti-Zionists who are supporting Trump, and he has a lot of support amongst anti-Zionist crowds, as we've talked about before, they're missing the point that they seem to believe that this whole, and it's a very emotional reaction, we've talked about that too, that this reaction to Trump is just this unprecedented thing, and it brings out this emotional reaction in them that, oh my God, Trump speaks our language, he's one of us, and they don't seem to be able to fathom the idea that this is a bigger operation at play here that's designed at them and is designed at their movement and the people that and designed at them themselves in many ways, perhaps. And I think, and we think that there's an unprecedented battle going on within what you maybe might call the global power structure, where you do have, I think, there's always been these two sides, and I think a lot of people, including me, and I'm sure you have too, been guilty of just portraying this global establishment as just one big wing, it's just it's just one big giant conspiracy and everybody's all on the same team. But you really look at it and you really look and dig deeper, that's not the case at all. There are at least, I think, two established sides to this whole globe, and there is and I think what you're seeing within the mainstream media with all this stuff about Russia and the hysteria about Trump and Russia, I think a lot of that is very real. There are people who are very fearful, very uncomfortable with the idea of the Trump administration being close to Russia strategically. I think that is real. I don't think that you're seeing all this. I wouldn't come out and say that all of this hysteria about the Trump and Russia is fake. I think it's very real and legitimate on the part of much of these media and this mainstream establishment figures. But also, when you look at the coverage of within the global publications that are anti-Trump, like the New York Times or Washington Post or some of your major European publications, it seems to me they have taken, in many cases, perhaps Washington Post not as much, but you read the New York Times or some of the other major global establishment outlets, they're almost equally critical of Benjamin Netanyahu as they are of Donald Trump. I think that what we're missing here is that, and when you bring in the connections to the far right elements of the Israeli establishment to Breitbart and to many of these quote alt-right sources that are now in the Trump White House and have direct influence over the president, I think that these outlets really see Trump and Netanyahu as 2-in-1. They see Trump and Netanyahu as like two sides of the same coin. They really see them as the same person in many ways. And I think that so many people are missing this when they just come out with like this reaction, like where they will not even fathom the possibility that perhaps Trump is working on behalf of a more hawkish wing of global Zionism. I think that they missed this point. They just want to, they have faith that Trump is going to be hostile to Israel because of some of the things he said, or some of the things that could be perceived that way, or he has this more nationalist rhetoric on domestic issues. I really think they see Trump and Bibi as two sides of the same coin, and see them as the exact same person. I think a lot of people miss the point on this.
This is a very complicated issue, but very important actually, because it does seem just on a first glance that the folks who appear at this point to be trying to excuse Trump for every sort of choice that is very shady in terms of his cabinet, or for every statement in terms of his closeness to Israel and Netanyahu specifically, that there's a justification there. And to me, it does seem that it lines up a lot with people whose politics are sort of ethnic or reactionary ethnic based at some level, in terms of the what you might call the anti-Zionist set in a way, and so that it's in this. I brought this up before, that when I called in to deal with like very specific facts on the ground about Michael Glassner running a deputy campaign manager, being tied directly into the people who facilitate the real estate that then got blown up on live television on September 11th. Alex tried to make it ethnic, like it was about more like Jews primarily voted against Trump. Or then that then sort of expands to what you brought up around, the New York Times is against Trump, at least on the surface. The New York Times is against Trump, right? So the New York Times is obviously, tied into the Jewish Zionist power configuration. There is obviously some type of difference here. Okay, this is where I think it is so important to then define the difference maybe between a Zionist power configuration and a globalist Zionist power configuration, and then Jewish people, especially Jewish American people, who are I'd say the majority of them are much more in line in terms of their own belief system with the Bill of Rights than with this sort of blood and soil type of hyper sort of chauvinistic nationalism that has become like the sort of totality of the Israeli government, of the Jewish state. So there is that's a major difference, and so that's one thing, and then also this vote in the UN again. Yeah. Basically every president before this has sort of brought these kind of votes up, has sort of pressed back a little bit against Israel. No president at this point, except for maybe Kennedy, in terms of post Israel, the birth of Israel, has actually tried to take a more firm stance in terms of the United States being a fair broker, right, even for its own interests, really, in the region. And of course, the Chomskys of the world would disagree with this, and that Israel is just a tale. And
what difference does it make?
Right. So what we can see is the politics of all of this is that every one of the. This is why I sort of made the assertion before that Trump might really be the first president that Israel has really owned. Yeah. Completely, because there was always some type of pushback. Reagan didn't do everything they wanted. Bush the elder didn't do everything that they wanted. Right. Clinton didn't do everything that they wanted, and
even
Bush,
W was had to take a stand against some of their settlements because of the backlash. They're trying to build alliances with the Muslim world.
Right, and to in order to try to keep up the facade that the war on terror is not a purposeful crusade or a clash of civilizations or something like that, but really a war on terror, because it's not. So this really does make some of these lines sort of clear. There is some difficult psychological warfare stuff at work in terms of what we talked about before, about that it may be that the sort of largely Zionist controlled corporate mainstream media was not really as big a foe to Donald Trump as it might have appeared. Sure. That's a possibility. But there's clearly is this split between the Anglo-American empire and then the Zio-American empire. And September 11th, I would say, would be the event where there was this an attempt to, well, there was already a conjunction from, I would say, from the USS Liberty attack onward, there was a conjunction of sorts, because the deal had been sealed by Johnson by covering that up and by participating in that. But from there onwards, there was a conjunction, but September 11th marked basically where Israel Firsters took the narrative lead, I would say.
Sure. And when you think about it, though, and a lot of people were like, oh, what do you mean Trump and Netanyahu are two in the same? They're obviously not, but the rhetoric's very similar. I mean, very, very similar. And I'm just noticing over the last couple of years in particular, I think we've gotten to the point to where, yes, the global power structure still supports Israel. Yes, most of your what you call the global Zionist power or configuration, rather than ones who are just strictly devoted to Zionism, yes, they support Israel. They're what you call liberal Zionists. I think, though, at this point, these people are. I think that Netanyahu really scares a lot of these more liberal-minded Zionists. He really scares these people because of what they see as his. They see him as almost being this unhinged person who could just at the drop of a hat just do something that would cause absolute chaos in the Middle East, which they do not want at this point. I mean, as far as an all-out war with, say, Iran or something. So, when you look at from my perspective, I think that they are really I think that these people are just. I almost think they're as anti-Netanyahu as they are anti-Trump because of the fear they have of him. And when you look at how psychological operations work, this has been a perfect psychological operation on the right wing of America, that because we've talked about before how the Republican establishment is so obsolete and so unpopular, and how you cannot sell a Bush or for that matter, you couldn't sell a Clinton either, really, at the end of the day. You cannot sell a Bush or even some of these more newer faces like Rubio or Ted Cruz. You could not sell these people to a conservative audience that was so angry about the concession on some of these social issues, and the conservative, what they see as not being hawkish enough on immigration, on stopping immigration. You cannot sell these people, so you create this, and you've seen these in these Western European nations as well, with this backlash against migration to Europe and the degradation of the traditional Christian culture in Europe, the traditional European culture. You're seeing this. It's a master psychological operation, and they've got so many of these people convinced that Trump is against the very thing that he might, as you said, be owned by.
Very, very interesting, and I think you're right that it's actually Trump and Netanyahu. At least their public political rhetoric is very aligned. If you think of the wall, right? Yeah. The wall. Where else is sort of wall more nationalistic than in Israel? Right, that's an important thing. Where the immigration stance is really key also to Israel, right? The sort of purity, the nativism, the sort of implied nativism, the protecting the blood. And this is of course the alt-right is being baited by the Trump campaign by sort of saying "Make America Great Again" is really code word for "Make America White Again," sort of similar "Make America Jewish Again," or actually Ashkenazi again in terms of the supremacist relationship to incoming African Jews in Israel. But then this connects to this sort of new relationship to Russia in terms of Israel. And this was a big deal. I think this was in the 80s when there was this big I think it was probably in the lead up or to the sort of dissolution of the Soviet Union, that there was a relationship set up where maybe millions of Russian Jews, and some of them not even really Jews, I don't think in terms of the strict Israeli sense, were sort of given over to Israel to bring up their population, and then you see some of these oligarchs that are talked about in Russia and modern Russia are obviously sort of Zionists. They're Jewish, and they got connections. And the sort of lone major standing oligarch is this Friedman guy, who, of course, a lot of the left missed completely, and of course the sort of controlled right missed it because there's actual serious issues here.
Can you
with
take
Trump.
A minute to talk about Friedman? Because I don't know how familiar people are with him.
I don't know that much about him, but he's tied into what I believe is the sort of most major bank in Russia, the Alpha Bank, which I believe was mentioned in this intelligence dossier that was put out. And of course, the emphasis became about the sort of urinating and the prostitutes and Putin saying it's all fake, but we do have the best ladies, you know.
Yeah.
But so the point about this is that Friedman is very much tied into Israel, and what was not mentioned in this dossier that was put out, and none of the sort of like controlled media, I would say left or right alternative, parse this out, but that this was a Zionist connection. This was a Zionist connection. So this whole Russia thing in terms of Trump, what it really is it shows the impotence at some level, if they're really against it, of the U.S. intelligence community, and the fact that they're not actually saying this is Netanyahu. This is not Russia. Russia may have had some type of sort of cutout proxy limited plausible deniability involvement, but this is a Netanyahu operation. And if you think about sort of Ukraine and Georgia, this is the ancient Khazarian homelands at some level. So this and you can also see the sort of Avigdor Lieberman set that's actually sort of to the sort of hard nativist right, supremacist right of Netanyahu has this Russian background. So those politics are tied in. And then one last real quick thing is that the Clean Break program, it said labor Zionism is dying. We need to reconstruct a new Zionism. And so that's what the rise of Netanyahu represents. And of course the Clean Break program was put to Netanyahu by these American Zionists, neoconservatives, to create a program for a new it's very, very much sort of like a hyper nationalistic, chauvinistic, militaristic strength through power, not strength, or peace through strength, not peace
through strength. The old Reagan adage.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if Ayelet Shaked is got this Russian background. She's one of the most hawkish of the Knesset members. Talking about killing Palestinians and all this. So makes you wonder. But that's a great point you bring up with the whole Russia thing. And I mentioned before that the actual dispute between the first Bush administration and the neocons was over the Russian immigrants and not wanting to give the money for the settlements. It seems that there's almost like a collaboration though between these elements to run Russia over with like new robber barons after the fall of the Soviet Union. But there's been a split since, whereas much like some Zionists or some of these neoconservative Zionist Likud sympathizers are more okay with Trump's nationalist rhetoric, whereas a lot of them are very fearful of it. I think you see the same thing with Russia, where Putin speaks a more nationalistic, traditional, patriotic vision for Russia when he makes his public speeches. And there's almost a split where some of them are more comfortable with Putin's nationalist rhetoric, whereas to the Robert Kagans of the world, it really terrifies them, this nationalist rhetoric coming from Putin, much like the nationalist rhetoric coming from Marine Le Pen or Nigel Farage or from the Viktor Orban in Hungary or Donald Trump in the United States. And Netanyahu's the common threat, and Netanyahu has that same ideology where, he doesn't give a shit, so to speak, as long as the president of the United States does what he thinks is best for Israel. He doesn't give a shit what ideology you should support. But there's a real split between the neoconservative Likud global establishment over this nationalist rhetoric and whether it's good or bad for us.
I would take it back just real quick, and maybe we should wrap up here because the library is closing. But this shorthand of in the neoconservatives between the Israel firsters and the Israel seconders, and the Israel seconders, the Kagan set, really do they want Russia as the main sort of enemy or counter, the nemesis, but the Israel firsters, it looks like, and we should look for this in the Trump era. Russia is either being set up, and Russia is of course complex. Putin is probably a different. Putin got rid of a lot of these oligarchs, but Friedman remains standing. Is that because he's a friend, or he was too powerful to get rid of? So there might be, similar to the CIA, multiple power sets in Russia, and Russia is either being set up, or there's an attempt to cleave Russia off. Because Netanyahu's main focus would be Iran, and Russia and China have both had an economic and political relationship with Iran, and in order to probably do it, with whether it's a coup or a military attack, they need to cleave off one of them at least, I would say, and probably that's what it looks like. They're trying to cleave off Russia, and they've sort of gotten Russia probably sort of wrapped up in this compromise operation at some level. So,
well, that's a great segue into our last topic, by the way, which is having related to China. And it's interesting, other than the Muslim thing, the big foreign policy boogeyman that's been built up under the incoming Trump administration is China. Everything from trade to the fear over like militarism, and the whole phone call to the president of Taiwan, that figures all into this very anti-China, xenophobic angle that the incoming administration is taking on China. But what gets me though about this is that if you really look through like the mainstream neoliberal publications for many years now, there was a time when I was following the New York Times pretty closely, and you couldn't go a week or 2 weeks at most without some quote liberal humanitarian organization representative talking about how terrible the human rights repression is in China. And you combine that with the recent Asia pivot under the Obama administration, this really flew under the radar big time, was this simmering up of tensions with China over whether it's over some of these small islands that are in the South China Sea that Japan claims is theirs and China claims they own, or disputes with Filipino and Vietnamese fishermen over rights to these. And what you have is the U.S. government has created these really close connections with these. And this is gone, by the way, completely ignored almost while everything's focused on Ukraine and Russia. The U.S. has built these very close affiliations with these governments that are they share the same xenophobic views of what we were just mentioning, like Philippines and Vietnam, and they all see China as a threat, and Japan even, to the point to where, for the first time since the end of World War II, Japan is remilitarizing under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And that's a very dangerous powder keg that almost seems like it could blow up at any time. But the alliance between China and Russia, that's been very well established, in Iran as well, over Syria, for example. And the conflicting rhetoric of the incoming administration is being very, what you would consider on the surface to be pro-Russia, but also very anti-China. I mean, the rhetoric coming out against China scares me in a lot of ways. That's interesting dichotomy, and the theory's been thrown out that a guy like Henry Kissinger, his affiliation with the Trump administration could be to help create a split between Russia and China when it's a time when it's very critical, their alliance is very critical to perhaps keeping peace within the Middle East, or in the relation with Iran, that this could be the last thing standing between complete isolation and perhaps the bringing down of Iran, either through sanctions or either through destabilization from within, or an all-out war.
Yeah, this is a good point, and this is an important evolving relationship here, I would say, of maybe more the consensus amongst the sort of Washington, European Zionist elite, right? This is a consensus here in terms of neoliberalism as the global economic model, right? Globalization economics, right? So you see the relationship with Japan, the U.S. relationship economically with Japan, in terms of sort of the end of the major era of U.S. industrialism, 70s into 80s, right, was very, very close. Then after the fall of communism, right, so-called, and Soviet Union ending, then there's this rise of this really close economic neoliberal globalism relationship with China and the United States. The rise of the tech industry, very much dependent on Chinese manufacturing, Apple, all of that type of scenario, right? So there's been really close. and the monetary relationship, the debt relationship. This was a really 2-decade-long, really close relationship with the U.S. and China, and it looks like things are there. The Asian pivot that you spoke of in terms of the sort of latter part of the Obama administration is tied into the remilitarization, the re-escalation of the Pacific theater in a way. And right before the Abe administration in like 2008, and right in there 2007, 2008, there was a party that had never been in power. I forget, the Democratic National Party or something like that. And one of their leaders, Yukihisa Fujita, was very friendly to September 11th Truth, and had invited people to go to the Japanese Diet, their parliament, to present on 9/11 Truth. Richard Gage was invited to talk about the buildings being blown up. Soon thereafter, there's Fukushima. There's a lot of analysis of Fukushima as some type of U.S. Rockefeller, Israeli Rothschild industrial sabotage
Shut
operation.
Up, conspiracy theorist.
Right. Well, yeah, I'm old school. I'm not fake news, or I'm a conspiracy theorist.
There you go.
Conspiracy analyst. So, well, let's continue these conversations moving forward, because I agree with you. There's a lot of dangerous situations coming up, but I believe if we can counter the weaponized narrative, then there are possibilities of the rising consciousness of not only the United States of America, but around the world.
Yeah, we've just got a few minutes left, but
I don't know if we do.
We got a couple minutes.
Okay.
But the idea, I think I've said, and I really think that while everybody's focused on Russia, the powder keg to spark off something big could happen in the South China Sea. I mean, and that's just so under the radar. Just like everybody was paying attention to Europe probably in months leading up to Pearl Harbor, and where did it happen? The big powder keg that got the U.S. into the war was in Pearl Harbor. You could see the same thing with the South China Sea. I mean, this is really serious rhetoric coming out with these rulings saying that China does not have sovereignty over its own waterways. I mean, that's just like saying that the U.S. does not have sovereignty over the Gulf of Mexico. It's insane, and it's really troublesome, and it's a major thing to keep concerned about. One day till the inauguration. You have any final thoughts?
Let's just keep our eye on the ball. There is a lot of possibility, but let's not be duped here. Let's not fall into either identity politics or counter-identity politics or reactionary forms of politics. We need to create a real politics that's based on serious analysis. That includes fact-checking, admitting if you got duped or you were wrong or there's new analysis. But I think you're right. We need to pay attention to China. Kissinger is a key factor here. Maybe we should go look back to when Kissinger went in the middle of the sort of Syria flame up and went to Russia, I believe, and there was a deal potentially that was struck.
There's something going on with Kissinger and Putin for sure, and that we don't quite know what it is, but that's really fascinating. And two things I'm looking forward to here in the next day or so. I think that this is my theory here, that you're going to be seeing some alt media people get their street cred by possibly getting arrested during the inaugural protests or whatever.
There's definitely going to be some so-called confronting the so-called commies.
Well, Alex Jones is a person who was riding shotgun with him today when he was reporting live from D.C., said on air, I'm wearing a purple jacket because I'm going to try to infiltrate the anti-Trump protests. That's what he said. He said that on air. And the other thing to look forward to, I'm interested to see what comes out of this, quote, deplorable, because the recently allegedly poisoned Roger Stone is going to be there, and I wonder if any of the speeches are going to be leaked or if there's going to be a live feed, because it'd be interesting to see some of the statements that are made at that event, if you want to shed some light into the makings of the alt-right, as far as, because when you really listen closely, they say a lot of things that are very revealing. And it just almost seems to me like this whole Buzzfeed thing is just an example of how intel agencies that may be friendly to the whole Infowars crowd, alt-right crowd, are just giving these people fake leaks so that they can claim that they're the ones who break the news.
That's a good point. Anyone who supports the alt-right or sort of Infowars-style right media needs to interrogate them for their sources. When Alex tells you he has high-level sources, but he doesn't say who it is what kind of double fact-checking is he doing? Is he just being fed disinformation? Is he talking to Paul Vallely, or Jerry Boykin, and just sort of basically taking their word as gospel?
Hey, Jerry Boykin loves mom, apple pie, and the flag. Don't criticize him.
So do I, but I'm willing to tell the truth about September 11th treason.
All right, well, we're signing off for now, and until next time, just, don't be duped.
Don't be duped.
All right, peace out.
All right, peace. May things go fairly smoothly tomorrow.
Indeed. Hey, that was a lot. That was